Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing my fancy booktube hat, and today I'm going to be bringing you my wrap-up for this round 2 of the DiverseAthon. It ran from the 22nd through the 29th. I'll leave the information for the readathon down below in the description if you'd like to learn more about it, and watch out for whenever they come back with another round. And as with my first DiverseAthon wrap-up, I'm also including a mini book haul as part of this video, because like last time, I decided that during the DiverseAthon week I was going to keep my eyes open to the prospect of purchasing some diverse books that I might not have otherwise leapt on and purchased, and so I'm going to be showing a few of those books here. Now, the first thing that I read during the DiverseAthon week was shorter fiction. I believe this is novelette length. I'm not quite sure what the word count is or what the requirements are, but I think it's somewhere between a typical short story and a novella, and that is The Terracotta Bride by Zen Cho. Now, Zen Cho is an author of Malaysian descent, and this story features a Malaysian protagonist in the Chinese afterlife, so this is an own voices story. I thought this was a clever story. It's about a teenage girl who has died unexpectedly and also unexpectedly finds herself in the Chinese afterlife. She and her family are Christians, so she was not expecting this. I personally didn't know much of anything about the Chinese afterlife going in, so this was an interesting setting for me to try to figure out as I was reading. We learned that when she arrived in the afterlife, a deceased relative of hers had her married off to an older, wealthier man who has considerable position and influence within the society of the afterlife. So she's fairly well off, but she is not happy. The story follows what happens when the husband brings home a new wife, the Terracotta Bride of the title, and she is not human. We learn that she's far more advanced than the terracotta warriors that are blundering about in the afterlife, but she is something of a mystery, and her purpose is something of a mystery. And I will say that going into this story knowing that it was a bit about artificial intelligence in the afterlife, I had preconceived notions of where this story might be going and what themes it might be dealing with that were not 100% accurate. This story surprised me. It had an ending that was bittersweet and satisfying, I thought. The only real qualm I have is that there were a couple of aspects and elements of the story that I wish had gotten more fleshed out or further explored, because there were some places where I still had some questions come the ending. So starting short and getting slightly longer in length, the next thing I read was Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor. I had this arc that I won in a Goodreads giveaway. This came out on the 31st, which was yesterday as I'm filming this. I don't know by the time this gets uploaded. But this is out now, and it is the sequel to the novella Binti, which has been highly acclaimed on BookTube. So I am going to do a review of this, so I'm going to be fairly brief here. These novellas are sci-fi that draws upon African culture. They follow Binti, a girl from the minority Himba tribe who leaves her home in an act of defiance to attend an interstellar university. And as the title suggests, this book follows what happens when she returns home after going away and being changed by the events of the first book. This may be an unpopular opinion. This may turn out to be an unpopular opinion, but I liked this one better than the first book. It's a little longer. I found it to be more character-driven, whereas Binti was more plot-driven. We see more of Binti's world in this book, which I thought was wonderful, and one thing that I think a lot of people wanted more of in the first book. Not a whole ton happens in a big flashy sense, which is why I'm guessing that my preference for this book may become an unpopular opinion. But while I thought Binti was really interesting, Binti Home moved me emotionally much more. And then the third book that I read was Starry River of the Sky by Grace Lin. This is a middle grade fantasy novel based on Chinese folklore. It's one of 3 sort of companion novels that she's written and illustrated that all stand alone perfectly well. The first one was Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, which I have already read. I own the 3rd one, When the Sea Turned to Silver, which I purchased as part of my DiverseAthon book haul for the first round, but I wanted to read this one before I got to that one. These books are really, really sweet middle grade stories. They skew a little younger, I think, in target audience than the middle grade I normally read, but that means they're very quick reads for me. And they're just touching and lovely little sweet books. Grace Lin is an Asian American author, and in her author's notes she talks about how she really wasn't interested in the Chinese folklore and stories that were made available to her when she was a child, but she became more interested in that heritage of hers as an adult, and she wanted to write books, sort of the books that weren't there for her when she was a kid. This book is about a little boy named Nnedi. At the beginning of this book, he's a stowaway in a merchant's cart. He gets discovered and kicked out and ends up as a chore boy at the inn in a small village called Clear Sky. We don't know what he was running away from or why, but he takes an immediate disliking to this humdrum small town and its people. He's clearly got some lessons that he has to learn. He's a bit of a grumpy child. And in addition, he has noticed that the moon is missing from the sky of this village, and he hears at night this incessant howling that no one else seems to hear. Soon a woman shows up at the inn named Madame Chang, and she brings with her an air of mystery and a trove of stories. Through Madame Chang's stories, Nnedi slowly becomes willing to tell his own stories, whereas Min Lee in Where the Mountain Meets the Moon went on a physical journey. Nnedi's journey in this book is an emotional journey. As with that book, all of the stories begin to grow and build upon each other and link together, and it's very satisfying, very sweet. I would recommend these books highly to families with children, or if you're just in the mood for this type of story. They're physically gorgeous books. The color illustrations are lovely. I was quite pleased with this, and I gave it 4 stars, which is the same rating that I gave to Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. Now, when I finished that book, I thought I would have enough time left in the readathon to read a full novel. I was wrong. I was not able to complete another full novel, but I did get about 40% through Thorn by Intisar Khanani. I was reading this on my Kindle. Intisar Khanani is a self-published Muslim American author of Pakistani heritage, I believe, and she is an author of young adult fantasy books. This one is a retelling of the fairy tale The Goose Girl. One of the reasons that I'm glad I now have a Kindle is that it makes it much easier for me to seek out and read books by self-published authors. This is one that's been on my radar for a long time that I just was never going to end up reading unless I got an e-reader. I didn't know going into it whether it was going to have any actual diverse representation in the book. It seems to me to be a pretty traditional young adult fairy tale fantasy retelling. I wouldn't necessarily consider any of the characters in it diverse, but Intisar Khanani is an author that I'm really glad to have discovered, and I'm glad to be reading her work. And just to let you know, I did finish this on the 31st, so it will be in my January wrap-up. So on to the book haul portion of the video. I have 3 physical books that I got at a used bookstore and 1 Kindle book. I got really great deals on all of these because you know me, I almost never pay full price for a book. So here goes. So the first book I have is Haroun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie. I've heard that this is probably one of the most accessible places to start with his writing. It is, I think, marketed for younger readers, and it seems to be sort of along the lines of the Grace Lin books with, you know, stories about stories and stuff like that. I love stories about stories. They have a special spot in my heart. Salman Rushdie is a British Indian author. I'm not exactly sure what part of the world this book takes place in, and what, if any, folklore it might be drawing from, but that's what I know about this book so far. The next book I have is If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo. People on BookTube are loving this book. It is an Own Voices YA contemporary novel about a trans girl who's starting at a new high school. I gather that this book is quite heartwarming. The last time I tried to read a young adult contemporary book, it didn't go great for me. I'm hoping that this will turn around that trend. And then the last physical book I have here is Brave Story by Miyuki Miyabe, translated by Alexander O. Smith. Miyuki Miyabe is a Japanese author, and I am not particularly good about frequently reading books from other countries in translation. It's just not something that I manage to seek out nearly enough. I have actually read another book by this author before, though. I read The Book of Heroes, which I picked up from the library on a whim, just because the cover was gorgeous, and I was really lukewarm on it. She writes both fantasy and, like, thrillers, and I think some of her books are sort of in a gray zone in between those two genres. The Book of Heroes was interesting in some ways, but it didn't really work for me as a fantasy novel. I felt that the sort of big ideas weren't necessarily that great, but looking on Goodreads, a lot of people say that this is a book that they far prefer to that one. Brave Story is her book, I think, that is the most a fantasy book, and it's also intended for younger readers. This might be her only book that's really considered YA, I'm not sure. But I want to give this a go, in part just because I don't see a lot of fantasy from Asian countries in translation, and I wish I saw more of it. And I am genuinely expecting to like this more than The Book of Heroes based on the Goodreads reviews I've read. I have to say, though, this book is long. This book is over 800 pages, so I'm not sure when I'll get around to reading this, maybe if Tome Topple happens again. And then I mentioned that I picked up an ebook on Kindle. I don't have much on it yet, but I'm slowly accumulating a few odds and ends, and so I purchased On the Edge of Gone by Corinne Duyvis on the Kindle store. Corinne Duyvis is the founder, I think, of the Own Voices movement. This is a young adult sci-fi book that features an autistic protagonist. I've been a little lukewarm about whether or not I was ever going to want to read this book, just because it is like an apocalypse is coming novel, which generally doesn't appeal to me. That makes me feel a little panicky sometimes. But from what I've heard, this is really a more thoughtful book and less end of the world book, even though that's the premise. I gather that it focuses on themes that have to do with how we as a society decide who is valuable. And it was only $1.29 on the Kindle store, so if it still is, you should know that it's only $1.29 on the Kindle store. Anyhow, that is all. Let me know if you participated in DiverseAthon, if so, what you read. If you have any book recommendations, I'd love to hear them. That is all. Bye for now.